democracy is fine if and only if it accords with U.S. state and corporate power interests. So it's fine in Eastern Europe, at least up to a point, but not in our own domains. The vast majority of U.S. aid to Honduras was never suspended after the coup. In contrast, after recent military coups in Mauritania and Madagascar, aid was immediately suspended. The U.S. also prevented the Organization of American States from adopting a resolution refusing to recognize Honduran elections carried out under the dictatorship, elections that Washington quickly applauded. The coup in Honduras preserves for Washington its Palmarola military base, which was called the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S.-run forces attacking Nicaragua during Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America in the 1980s, and that base is becoming increasingly valuable today as Latin America, especially South America, takes steps towards independence. After the Honduran election, such as it was, Arturo Valenzuela, that's Obama's State Department official in charge of Western Hemisphere affairs, he told the press that the issue is not who is going to be the next president. The Honduran people decided that, choosing between two coup supporters while the elected president was holed up in the Brazilian embassy. Obama's representative to the Organization of American States, meanwhile, instructed the backward Latin American peons that they should join the United States in the real world, abandoning their world of magic realism, and they should recognize the military coup as Big Brother had done. Obama even broke new ground in support for the military coup. There are two government-funded organizations that are supposed to support democracy in the world, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, two political parties. The International Republican Institute regularly supports military coups to overthrow elected governments, most recently in Venezuela in 2002 and Haiti in 2004. But up until now, the National Democratic Institute had held back, including these two cases. In Honduras, for the first time, Obama's National Democratic Institute agreed to observe the elections under military rule, unlike the Organization of American States and the United Nations, which are still wandering in the realms of magic realism, refusing to join the United States in the real world. The overthrow of democracy in Honduras takes its place in deeply rooted and consistent policies and attitudes which trace far back. They trace back to the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, which essentially declared that the U.S. is sovereign in the hemisphere. Well, that couldn't be implemented at the time because of the British deterrent, but later it was as U.S. power increased and Britain's declined. And it's taken very seriously. When Cuba finally attained its independence in 1959, the United States reacted at once, within months, in fact, with significant terror escalated during the Kennedy administration and economic warfare. And the reasons were plainly stated in internal documents of the Kennedy-Johnson era. The reason was Cuba's successful defiance of American policies going back 150 years, that is, to the Monroe Doctrine. No Russians, just successful defiance of orders. The warfare over these years has been carried out with quite incredible savagery and intensity. It's quite enlightening to look at the details. And also in opposition to the will of the public. Well, that's normal. But more interestingly, even in opposition to major segments of the business world, the pharmaceutical industries, energy industries, agribusiness, and so on, that's more unusual. And it's an indication of the importance of the state interest in punishing successful defiance. It's what we might call the mafia doctrine, one of the leading principles of international affairs. The Godfather does not tolerate disobedience for good reasons. It might spread and the system of control might erode. The basic outlines of policy were outlined with regard to Latin America, were outlined by the National Security Council in 1954. I'll quote their document. The primary threat to U.S. interests in Latin America is posed by radical and nationalistic regimes that appeal to the masses of the population and seek to satisfy the popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. These tendencies conflict with the demand for a political and economic climate conducive to private investment with adequate repatriation of profits and protection of our raw materials. Ours, though by accident they happen to be somewhere else. A large part of subsequent history flows from these unchallenged conceptions. Honduran President Zelaya was beginning to challenge these fundamental principles. The New York Times reported with unusual clarity that the coup reflected a yawning political and socioeconomic divide. For the small upper class, Zelaya was becoming a threat to what they called democracy, namely the rule of the most powerful business and political forces in the country. The New York Times account is quite accurate. He was initiating such dangerous measures as a rise in the miserable minimum wage in a country where 60% live in poverty. So plainly, he had to go. Honduras is a weak enough state and sufficiently under U.S. control so that it was possible to resort to the classic method of military coup, a coup, of course, concealed with polite rhetoric. Well, there's much more to say about imperial projects in the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere, but I'll drop the matter, which I think Tariq will address in his talk today. Without further elaboration, as these examples illustrate, the progress towards a new world with more respect for peace and justice is not mirrored in the North. And much the same is true internal to the rich countries. We've just witnessed the dramatic collapse of the neoliberal policies that have wrought havoc in the South and also in the rich countries insofar as they've been applied, limited ways. In the United States, real wages for the majority of the population have stagnated or declined for 30 years, while economic growth has found its way into very few pockets, bringing about the worst inequality, at least since the 1920s, perhaps ever. That's one of the many harmful consequences of the substantial shifts in international economic policies from the 1970s, when the post-war Bretton Woods system was abandoned and the financialization of the economy began its grim course. At the beginning of this process in the United States, financial institutions accounted for perhaps 3% of gross domestic product. Now it's about a third. An important concomitant was the hollowing out of the productive capacity of the domestic society.